Hello, and welcome to EPR with your favorite environmental enthusiasts, Nic and Laura. On today's episode, Laura and I discuss what makes a good storyteller. We talk to Fred Wagner about court cases, the pending CEQ Phase II Rule, and his trip to Monza. And finally, alligators and crocodiles can climb trees. That's right, folks. Just when you thought dry land was safe, the American murder logs could be lurking over your head. Sleep well, everybody.
Oh, that does not bode for my recurring nightmares.
Get that music.
This is the last call for abstracts for NAEP's 2023 Annual Conference and Training Symposium happening in Phoenix, Arizona from May 7th to 10th, 2023. Showcase your work to an audience of national and Arizonian environmental professionals at its 2023 conference. Abstracts can be submitted for oral presentations, posters, workshops, and special sessions of national and Arizonian concern. Please check it out at www.naep.org. And that is, again, happening in 2023, but your proposals are due in 2022.
Correct.
Looking for a great sponsor opportunity? 60% of listeners have bought something from a podcast ad, and we are up to 25,000 downloads with over 400 per episode. If you'd like to sponsor the show, please head over to environmentalprofessionalsradio.com and check out the sponsor form for details. We appreciate you immensely, and you are what helps keep the show going. Let's get to our segment.
So we talked to Fred yesterday, and I remember yesterday thinking in my head as he was talking in the beginning, especially, I was like, wow, there's going to be some really good stuff from this.
Yeah, I think probably the funnest thing, though, was his story about his misadventure in Italy.
In Italy, yeah, and trying to get to Monza.
Spoiler alerts.
He goes to Monza. But he's a great storyteller. It's really fun to have him on.
I know. That too, maybe just storytelling. I think like I said, and actually Sam, our volunteer, and I were chatting about this afterwards, just I have no interest in politics and listening to that and the news. And since I'm not doing permitting or NEPA, like I don't have any need to like be up on the cutting edge of what's happening in DC and whatever. But when he starts talking about it, I'm like, wow, that's cool. That's interesting. Yeah. Tell me more.
100%. And that's like the power of a good storyteller, right? You take something that is, seemingly dull, like just trying to get on a train, and it's one of the most captivating things you've ever heard. And it's just kind of the beauty of storytelling, right? You ground it in something human, and you attach emotion to it, which is the number one thing you need in a good story, right? And suddenly you become invested, and the stakes are your stakes, and then you kind of want to hear more about it. And you can't fake it. You can't fake passion. You can't fake interest. Well, I guess some of my comic friends would say you could, but it's...
I was going to say, I think there's a couple of people in politics and acting that do a pretty good job, but they're pros.
Yeah, they're pros.
And the rest of us to fake it.
Even then, it's still rooted in an actual emotion, right? No matter what, you're still drawing on your experience to give somebody that perception. So it still is... A great story has to have emotion behind it. Otherwise, it's just, you telling words, and that's not the same thing. Yeah. He's one of the best. So I wish I could talk about it like that.
Yeah, I don't think people are, well, let's not go down that hole. We suck at storytelling. Want to listen to our podcast?
No, we shouldn't. You're right. We're right. We are pretty, I'm pretty good at it. I like doing it. We are pretty good at it. But yeah, he's a master. That doesn't mean we can't learn,
Oh, totally. But yeah, I was watching, just because one does watch The Great Dictator for no reason on a Friday night. But that speech at the end, you know what I'm talking about?
No, I haven't seen it.
So it's a Charlie Chaplin movie. It was put out in 1940, and it's a comedy. But the end has this brilliant, if you just go on YouTube and just watch the story or the speech that he gives at the end, and you're just like, oh, it's frustrating because you're like, why aren't people getting this? It is a brilliant story. And he says it so passionately that you're like, is he acting or is he really like, I think he's just really into it. It's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I say, I like that we're also saying that this is something you can get better at. Like if you don't think you're good at storytelling, or if you want to get better at storytelling, you have to practice. It's one of the reasons I started doing stand-up. It's just like I wanted to get more comfortable in uncomfortable situations. And you actually also learn quite a bit by stories. One of my favorite shows that we used to do pre-pandemic was a storytelling show where it's like, hey, you guys are not allowed to tell your bits. You have to tell a story, and your singular story can be incredibly hilarious, and you learn how people do that. There's still punchlines, there's still jokes, but they're based on one story. There's always really, really great examples of that in the comedy world, but it applies really well. Like when you listen to Fred's interview, you're going to be captivated and interested because of his ability to tell good stories.
Yeah. And one of the things he does really well is like take a boring subject like environmental law, potentially boring. Don't offend anybody. But he uses analogies and he's, compares it to something else that you can relate to.
Yeah. Yeah. And he has an energy and passion for it as well. It's incredible. I love it.
Yeah. You can definitely tell he loves his job and he is good at it.
Yeah. 100%. Why don't we go ahead and wrap up and you guys can hear for yourselves.
Let's do it. Welcome back to EPR. Today we have Fred Wagner, Venable LLP, on our show. Today he is joining us as the official environmental legal correspondent. I think this is your 6th time here. So welcome back, Fred.
It's great to be here and it's great to be official.
I think you were official before, but I'm laying it back today. Yep. Yeah. So we're going to start off with some easy lobs for you because there's some serious stuff to talk about later. Why don't you we'll talk about your job a little. What point does an environmental consultant call you in? Are you like on retainer with your clients, or do they call you after they've gotten into trouble like a lot of other specialties?
Yeah. I mean, the classic case is when you have that, oh crap moment where you realize that you need counsel. One story in particular, literally my phone rang at my desk in my office and I picked up the phone and the client was whispering. And which doesn't happen very often over the phone. I mean, it's on the phone, like, why are you? And he said, Fred. I said, yeah, why are you whispering? And he explained that he was whispering because he was at a public hearing.
Oh, no.
And he said in a whisper voice, which I won't whisper completely, he said, people are yelling at us. They didn't expect it. They didn't expect that there would be opposition or there would be promises. So what do we do? I said, well, what are they yelling you about? Mm-hmm. And he explained that they were questioning a lot of the work that came out in the environmental document that his office had prepared. And they just weren't expecting that kind of pushback. Well, it turns out that there was a competitor who was upset about the particular project, and they had successfully gotten some citizens and whatnot to come and speak at the meeting.
No.
Oh, wow.
And cause all this ruckus. And that was the first time I was involved in that project. And I ended up being counsel to them as they prepared their final EIS and actually, went through litigation. Other projects, the client is super aware that this is going to be a big deal and it's controversial, and they bring us on right away because they want that kind of guidance and understanding that how do we make this successful from a legal perspective, and then everything in between. And, from my perspective as a lawyer, we love when we're in early so that we can anticipate these issues and potentially try to diffuse them and or prepare for challenges in the future. But we realize, that's not always possible from a cost perspective, from a planning perspective, and all that kind of stuff. So it's ranged from the panicked phone call at the public hearing room to more deliberate kind of planning to get me involved early on.
Gotcha. So ideally, how can environmental consultants and lawyers work best together?
I think we've talked about this in the past. I'm a big Broadway fan, and one of the classic Broadway shows is Oklahoma, and one of the big numbers in Oklahoma is the farmer and the cowman can be friends. That's on the farmer and the cowman should be friends. And it talks about the rivalry between two seemingly compatible and simpatico communities, obviously both working the same land, but in different kind of ways. And I think in a lot of ways, consultants and environmental lawyers are just like the farmer and the cowman. We're doing a lot. We're doing a lot of the same stuff, covering a lot of the same ground, but we're approaching it from different disciplines and different ways of thinking. And so I try to encourage my consultant friends to say, hey, look, when I give you, suggestions on how to write something and whatnot, I'm not telling you, obviously, that I think that there's, lower quality wetlands or not. I don't know. That's
Right.
your job.
Right.
What I'm trying to let you know is that, hey, if we're anticipating certain challenges, or if we're anticipating pushback from our permitting agency partner, or if there's public controversy or what have you, how do we frame this in a way that answers these questions in a manner that people can get it and they can understand? And so my discipline as counsel is oftentimes, communication, it's writing, it's advocacy, especially when you're anticipating, a challenge in the future. And my friends' disciplines are technical accuracy, making sure that things are right as a matter of engineering principles. And I think the kumbaya moment between environmental counsel and consultants is making it all better. And, that old commercial, which I'm dating myself, where I forget which company it was. I think it was a chemical company. And their commercial tagline is this: we don't make the products, we make the products that you use better.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard that.
Yeah.
That's really the relationship, I think, between counsel and the consultant group. You guys do great jobs, technically accurate and beautiful stuff. We try to make it better. We try to make it approachable, readable, supportable from an advocacy perspective. And so that's what we try to do. And, honestly, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Because we are treading the same ground. Right. And Nic, colleagues of yours say, wait a minute, don't tell me how to write this. This is how we write it.
I'm thinking of something right now. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. And so the phrase that I often hear in my, dealings with your community is like, stay in your own lane. We hear that phrase all the time. Stay in your own lane.
That.
And it's like, well, dude, this is my lane.
That's what I had to say.
My lane is your lane. And how do we ride in that same lane together? And so, like I said, I've been doing this for a lot of years now. And the best way to develop a relationship of trust with, my consultant colleagues is to say, hey, when we get out at the end of the day, we're going to have something better. And your interest is making sure that if, the agencies have this material, the permit's granted. If it gets into a political spat, that all these answers are questioned. And if it gets into court, that the client wins.
Yeah.
And we're all in that together.
Yeah.
And once you develop that relationship and people are, rowing the same way or in the same direction, it works.
Yeah, that's funny. You're saying that, and it made me think immediately of just like, in my career, there's been moments where, and I'm sure this has happened to you, so I'm going to ask the question, but I already know the answer. Does anyone ever not follow your advice? And then how does that work out?
I think they should teach a course at law school titled, "What do you do when your client doesn't follow your advice?" Because I think it happens so often. And, when you're new to the profession, your expectation, I think, is, hey, I'm spending all this good time and effort to give you what I think is my best advice. Like, of course you can do it. And, when I started early on, and, that was my thinking, one of my mentors explained to me very clearly, he said, do not get your expectations and hopes up that that's going to happen all the time, because there's a million reasons why your advice, even though it's the best legal advice, may not be ultimately what the client decides to do. Yeah. There could be business concerns. There could be political concerns. There could be cost concerns. I mean, it just goes on and on. So your job is to give them the best advice you can based on your interpretations of the requirements that they're working under. But then if they decide to go in another direction for all those reasons or more, well, then you turn into their advocate and you give it 100% to support that. Now, are there instances when you give advice and the client says, I'm not going to do it, and their decision not to do it creates, true legal vulnerability? In which case you got to raise your hand politely and say no? Of course. Mm-hmm. Is that the most frequent occurrence? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because people get it. They know. But as long as your client understands that you reserve the right to raise your hand and say no, to indicate to them that no, this decision not to move in this direction, raises a real concern in terms of violations or so forth, then you're fine. But I learned long ago, thanks to one of my mentors, that, you just can't be offended if your client doesn't take your advice. Don't take it personally. You're educating them. You're making them aware of all the options. You're giving them a sense of risks if they do one thing or the other. But yeah, not following advice is part of the job, and, typical thing in a lot of our projects that you see is, the consultant creates these matrices, when they get all comments on stuff and they'll explain, adopted or whatever, or no, and oftentimes you'll see the no and you'll get an explanation as to why. And that's fine. That is absolutely fine. And I try to make my clients and my consultant partners comfortable with the fact, that I'm not going to be, stamping off in a huff if you don't accept every change that I make or whatnot. And the last piece of the puzzle, Nick, is when you're making comments and recommendations, you have to, as a lawyer, you have to discern between what's really, really important and the kind of stuff that, okay, you might do this or you might do that. And from my experience, the best lawyers are the ones who get that, right away. And so they know when to stick their necks out and say, this is something you really need to do, and let the clients understand where, you may have some discretion one way or the other, and explain why. And I always try to do that when I deal with folks.
That's great advice. I think that really applies to anyone in an advisor role. I can see the permitters having the exact same language around the advice they give to the developers, right? Yeah. We're telling you this is what you should do. If you do something else, there could be consequences. There could not be.
Yeah. I mean, what's the phrase that you always hear when we talk about NEPA reform and, permitting reform? Let's focus on what matters.
Right.
We hear that phrase all the time. And I think we do because, sometimes people get caught up in the moment. Maybe it's because the red pen has been in their hand and they figure they have to use it. Right? Right. I don't know what advice you get when you edit stuff, documents that you're writing or whatnot. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was read first without the pen in your hand.
Yep. Yep.
Read first without the pen in your hand, because your tendency, the pen's in your hand, you use it.
Yeah.
And you make those changes and whatnot, and that's fine. But is there a sense of the overall? Are you getting a sense of perspective of the thing that you're reading? Are they getting the point across? Are there things that the structure of the piece as a whole? And I think that's really good advice. To the extent you can, read, comprehend first, then pick up the pen, because you'll have a better sense of how what you read on page 1 fits with the stuff you're reading on page 10. And I try to do that as well.
Yeah, that's great advice. We also would like to take a moment to talk about Venable. And we know what your expertise is. We really appreciate Venable being a longtime sponsor for us. And what makes Venable different? If I am an environmental consultant and I'm looking for my options, why do I choose Venable?
Yeah, I think the thing that sets us apart is, our experience and our practical experience in getting projects done and working with you all. We've seen it from so many different angles and so many different sectors. Obviously, I came from my political job from the transportation sector, but I've worked in the mining sector. I've worked in the energy sector. I've worked in commercial development. I've helped build golf courses, and so that range of experience, that practical experience, is really what our group, hangs our hat on. And, we let people and our clients know that this is what we know you're hiring us. You're hiring us to get something done. You're trying to get your project built. You're trying to get your approval done. And, we're in it for that as well. Positive results, practical results for our client. And we know sometimes the process is not linear, to say the least. Yeah. For a whole bunch of reasons that are, sometimes way out of your control. So to try to help explain to the client how to manage those things and always move forward, always getting to the end result. So I like to think that's what we do.
Yeah, which is great. And I say we do appreciate it. And it is so awesome to have you here.
And the other thing I'll add is the thing that's great about Venable. I'm here based in DC. We have such a great presence in the nation's capital. And for so many of the projects that we get involved in, you want to say it's not political. Everything's political to a certain extent. And so to have the wherewithal about how these agencies work, the things that they're concerned about from a political perspective, we have a fantastic, government affairs group that I coordinate with, all the time. And to have that Washington, D.C. perspective, especially for the big deal projects, the ones that, are getting that kind of attention, really, really helps. That you can pick up the phone, have, respectful and productive dialogue with the folks at the agencies. I think that's something we do really well.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. And, it's a good segue to our next conversation because, we talked last time about the Supreme Court and we had you on right after the Roe v. Wade decision, right? Which is obviously monumental for lots of reasons, but nothing else happened after that, right? Like nothing else is going. And I know I'm joking, but the other big thing that came out right after you were on was the West Virginia versus EPA decision relating to the Clean Air Act. So we talked about what might happen in your episode, and that's exactly how it went. And, there's no surprises there. But let's talk then more about what the repercussions of using the major questions argument are. What are we going to see in the future?
Right. Just a quick summary. We're speculating, and then we were correct, that the majority of the Supreme Court was going to look at the regulations of the Clean Air Act to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from power plants and rein in the agency under the major questions doctrine, which is basically the doctrine that says, something so important, so influential to the economy and management of an industry overall that, we just, due to separations of powers, we just don't want to leave it to the agency on its own devices to go ahead and do something. We need some clear direction from Congress to say, thou shalt do this in a particular kind of way. And that's oversimplifying it, but that's generally kind of what the doctrine's all about. When the ruling came out, it was interesting in that I thought this, I think most legal scholars agreed with me, that the actual effect vis-a-vis greenhouse gases was probably much more limited than folks had worried about, because it was really focused on a narrow portion of the Clean Air Act, a particular provision. And it doesn't mean that there's no regulation possible, for carbon emissions ever. It was relatively specific. And so to a certain extent, there was a little bit of a sigh of relief. The notion of dealing with GHGs generally was not off the table. The court didn't take the opportunity to, reverse the determination from EPA that allowed the regulation of greenhouse gases originally, but just to that particular provision. However, the major questions doctrine is not limited just to this area. I mean, It's applying to a lot of different areas, not necessarily environmental areas. And so to me, the biggest consequence of the ruling, guys, is that it is now the roadmap for folks who don't like a particular rule, particular regulation to say, hey, you shouldn't be going there, agency. You went too far, and the court, we need you to rein in the agency. So what are we seeing? The Securities and Exchange Commission, disclosure reporting rule, not final yet. It's not even final yet. But the state of West Virginia and a bunch of other states wrote a supplemental letter to the comment docket, and they previewed quite clearly that, okay, if you guys want to go final, up to you, but boom, we're going to be right out of the gate with a challenge on the major questions doctrine. Does the SEC have the authority to require the disclosure of the sorts of things for GHG emissions that you're proposing under this rule? We're seeing it in terms of non-environmental things. Biden's loan forgiveness, student loan forgiveness order. There's talk that the Republican members of Congress are going to challenge it under the major questions doctrine, saying you don't have the authority to do that. Congress has to act. And on and on and on. And it's going to be broadly used in many, many different contexts, mostly environmental, I think, because it's kind of the flashpoint for a lot of this, but it's going to be used all over. And so what's going to happen is that over time, and it's going to take time, right, the scope of the application of the major questions doctrine will be defined by examples of specific rules, specific agency actions where the courts either give the thumbs up or the thumbs down. And it's going to be defined that way. I read a brief that was filed, I think, by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on some obscure aspect of its rules, where I think the state of Texas raised the major questions doctrine. And the briefing went into, gory detail from the government's briefing about, look, this is what the statute says. This is what the language of the statute provides. Congress clearly intended us to do this. We have done that in the past. It's been upheld. And they went through all the different factors that were laid out by the Supreme Court to defend, this particular regulatory action that the NRC was taking. My point is that that's going to be repeated. That drill, that analysis is going to be repeated over and over and over again. And then ultimately, after a year or so, we're going to see when courts say, oh, it's going to be really important to see this kind of language from Congress, or it's going to be really important to see this type of authority granted to the agencies to define what's going to fit into the scope of the agency authority. It's not going to be one size fit all. It's going to be different program to program, agency to agency, but there will be a body of case law that develops. And I guarantee you that some of the folks who challenge these rules are going to go too far. They're going to say, oh, such and such is a major questions doctrine, and they're going to get knocked down. The courts are going to say, no, it's pretty obvious right on the face of the statute. And there's going to be other cases where it might be the same result that you saw in West Virginia v. EPA. But that's what's going to happen, and that'll take time. There'll be different cases that'll work their way up the appellate, structure in the federal courts. But that's what's going to happen, and it's starting right now.
Right now, yeah. Well, I mean, just even from a scientific perspective, it seems it's really hard for me to wrap my brain around, okay, well, this agency is supposed to do a thing, right? Its job is to take information to make a decision based on the information available. And now we're saying, well, no, actually, the job of that is going to be Congress. And I guess I'm still struggling with why that's what would actually Congress be doing? If they decide to do, okay, we are going to do greenhouse gases. Are they using scientists to come up with this or some kind of data to come up with a decision? Or is it strictly gut feeling or economically driven or something like that?
Well, this is the problem that the dissent in West Virginia versus EPA pointed out. They said, is Congress really equipped to do this? We think not, the dissent said, for a whole variety of reasons. Now, think about the variety of statutes that you deal with in your day-to-day life. The Clean Air Act, hundreds and hundreds of pages is long with great specificity, yes. Right? And then the Clean Water Act, regulate waters of the United States. And we've been fighting over that for 30 years.
I know. Yeah.
So are we going to be relying on Congress to figure that out in the first instance? And so the sense is that's a recipe for disaster, because that's not what those men and women do, certainly not what they do well. The whole point is that they authorize activity in a certain area, and then the experts from the executive branch do something. And then we, as the third branch, the judicial branch, have oversight to say, whether they went too far or not. But if we if we just wait for Congress to act on one thing or another, are they really going to do that? And with respect to greenhouse gas, that was a great example. The dissent said, yeah, it's one thing to say separation of powers, let Congress do it, but are they going to do it?
Yeah.
Are they really going to do it for political reasons or what have you? I don't think so. And then the majority said that could be true and it could be frustrating, but them's the breaks. It's separation of powers. Congress writes the laws and the agencies implement the laws. So unless we hear from Congress expressly, where we're going to see this next, Nick?
Yeah.
PFAS.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
We're going to see it on the forever chemicals regulation that they're writing at EPA, and the ability to get cleanups under a Superfund and what have you. The Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is already very expressly signaled that they're going to say that this is something that is clearly triggers the major questions doctrine, just because of the potential cost to the economy of now regulating and dealing with these materials over time. And it's going to be a classic application of this question. Classic. Because you're going to have the environmental community. I assume you'll have the EPA and this Justice Department, at least. What are you kidding me?
Yeah.
What is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act and TSCA and Superfund? What are they except authorization of the government to deal with the disposal of, regulation of, and the cleanup of hazardous materials? Well, here is one. It may not have been front of mind when the statutes were passed 30 years ago, but we sure know about it now. How could we not have the authority to do that? Are we going to have to wait chemical by chemical by chemical for Congress to come and say, oh, now regulate that,
Yeah.
And then the other side's going to say, well, maybe so, but you're admitting by your own analysis, EPA, that the cost of dealing with these cleanups is going to be $100 quadrillion. Well, if that's not a major question, I don't know what is. So that's the kind of dialogue you're going to see in the courts.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. I actually amusingly had a conversation about significance in NEPA and how it has nothing to do with money. But money is a very important driver when we're talking about projects. And, in your mind, you're like, well, there should be no limit on people's health, right? What is the cost of cancer? The answer is there is no cost. You should try to treat the cancer. Don't just, you know what I mean? So it's just a challenge though, because, there is money involved as well. So I don't know how we solve that problem. And I guess we'll see over time.
Just the other day, I think we might be, getting to this in a different context, but just this week, you got to be, I'm sure, every week because so much is happening. But just this week, the Louisiana court struck down permits for major petrochemical plant proposals in Louisiana, largely on the grounds of the impacts that it's going to have to the environmental justice communities in Louisiana. About a year ago, the Army Corps of Engineers announced that it was going to revisit the NEPA analysis for those proposals, but now it looks like the proposals are dead. And it's a classic case. You say it's about the money, but it's monetizing the impacts to that community over time from a health perspective, from an economic perspective and whatnot, not just from, a pollution perspective. And then trying to balance that with, the need for our economy that relies on, these chemicals and materials to build and make just about everything, right? And so, we're seeing that tension play out in many different ways. And I'd say, money is just one element of the major questions doctrine. I think it's certainly, a big one. But I think, the other aspects of it deal with just the day-to-day activities of the regulated community. Major questions being, are we going to be hiring lots of different people to do this stuff? Is it a new, expertise that we have to have? Does it involve, lots of technical issues? Those are all sorts of, issues that are tied up in the major questions doctrine. But there's no getting around, the money and then monetizing the values that you just articulated, between health, economic development, and it's just going to be an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, like I say, I know we got a lot of other things. I have so many more questions I wish we could get to. There's more stuff. There's just so much going on. As we've said every time we had you on, more and more keeps coming up. So, we also have new climate provisions that were identified in the Inflation Reduction Act that was also just passed recently. And a lot of times we talk about how bills have seemingly unrelated notes in them. But I think in this case, the state level climate actions are actually pretty relevant. So what's worth paying attention to here for our listeners?
Yeah, the one thing to keep in mind about the Inflation Reduction Act, first of all, in my view, has nothing to do with reducing inflation. I think the most progressive supporter of the bill would say it's a pretty odd name. They had to name it that, I guess, to get Manchin to sign on the bottom line. But the thing that's really important to remember about the bill is that it was done through reconciliation. Why is that important? Because this is, to your last question, this is all about the money. You can't do a reconciliation bill on non-budgetary stuff, is the bottom line. So the Inflation Reduction Act, at heart, in some ways is a tax bill. It's a bunch of tax credits, tax incentives. It's grants and dollars going to communities that have these economic effects that had to pass muster with the Senate parliamentarian so that it got folded under reconciliation. Otherwise, they couldn't do it.
Right.
So, for example, you couldn't fold in voting rights under the Inflation Reduction Act, although some people were trying to do that.
Right.
Because that's not a budgetary type thing. It's not a tax and money sort of thing. So why is that important? Because in a lot of ways, the incentives and the direction of the Inflation Reduction Act goes to enabling private parties, communities, states, etc., to adopt these actions that overall have a favorable effect on reducing carbon and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, according to the proponents of the bill, because there's economic benefits for doing so. You convert to using more green energy, you're getting a tax credit. If you're a consumer, and just like I'm doing right now, you switch your gas top range to electric, you can get a tax credit. You can get a rebate. Not a tax credit, you can get a rebate. It's all the money. And so a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act is going to focus on the actions that, again, the proponents of the bill sought to incentivize that all have the effect of, in a lot of folks' minds, advancing the way we either electrify our economy, whether we go to different technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and all the rest. And just internally at the firm, just to prove this point, the other day I had a conference with my colleague about, how we help explain to our clients about the implications of this bill. And my colleague was the chair of the tax practice at Venable. It was not another environmental lawyer. It was the tax man. And, so our challenge is like, how do we get this information into the hands of our clients when there's this overlap between financial law and environmental law and regulatory law? It was a really interesting conversation. But that's the point of this bill. A lot of pretty arcane financial incentives for different aspects of the economy, different industrial sectors. So I think that's one thing for our listeners to understand. It's not like a regulatory act. It's not like an authorization act for grants under the Highway Trust Fund or stuff. It's a little bit different in that it has as its goal, climate type action, but the vehicle is through tax.
That's really cool. That's neat. Like I say, like you talk about it, creativity and innovation. It's good to see that we can still do that because it's really important. I think it's a lot of what we do well. So you mentioned Manchin earlier, and I want to circle back to that too, because when there was the Manchin compromise, I would say it was pretty shocking to just about everybody except for, Manchin and Schumer. So it kind of came out of nowhere, which is so rare. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. But I also want to know, what are the possibilities, the permitting reform legislation possibilities coming out of this compromise? And will that impact the CEQ's Phase II Rule?
Senator Manchin, one of his long objections to some of the Build Back Better proposals when it was a much bigger proposal, when it was, a couple of $1 billion or more, was that we were going to try to do all these things. We were trying to build all these things, but there were these, in his mind, impediments out there in the form of environmental regulation, in the form of, NEPA, lengthy NEPA reviews, in the form of, litigation delays and so forth. And he was absolutely, he's a conservative Democrat. He was very concerned about all those things from the get-go, from a long time. So we're saying it's great that we're going to have all this money, but are we actually going to get these things out onto the ground? And so from the beginning, from the outset, he had this as an aim. And as we discussed last year, surprisingly, the bipartisan infrastructure law incorporated some permit reform by taking some of the Trump administration's executive orders, one federal decision executive order, and codifying that. Again, another compromise to try to get people on board. Well, Manchin and Schumer behind the scenes, we're talking not just the high level reforms, but they were very specific. There was like a couple of particular projects that Manchin was worried about, pipelines, going through his state and whatnot, and other sorts of projects to help promote the natural resources development in West Virginia. And those are some of the very controversial elements of the Inflation Reduction Act. We're basically given a free pass, to some of those things. One of those just happened yesterday. The major offshore lease sale. That was conducted. The government took the position that NEPA did not apply to that lease sale because under the bill, they only had 30 days to do it.
Oh, gosh.
And they did. And then they said it's a classic case of impossibility. There was no way that we could have done a full-scale NEPA review and met the mandates of Congress. So the sale was conducted with no NEPA. And there was, pending litigation over that sale. They made a filing with the court that said, hey, Your Honor, guess what? Case is moot. Wow. It's over. Congress acted. They said, do it within 30 days. If you have 30 days, even though we wanted to redo our NEPA, we couldn't do it. Nothing to see here, right? Wow. It's pretty remarkable. Well, part of the deal was that longer term, Manchin was going to get greater permit reform on top of all the other stuff that we've seen so far. And in fact, there was a document floating around Washington, D.C. that I talked to some people about, and folks from the administration swore up and down it wasn't them. That came from Manchin's office with some of the things that he wanted to see in terms of permit reform. Well, that one page is like one page. That one pager got out and all heck broke loose.
Yeah.
On the progressive side, they said, no, this is not, something we want. The conservatives were still ticked off that Manchin shook hands with Schumer. So they were ticked off at Manchin saying, oh, you think you're going to get my support for this permanent reform? Well, I'm still mad at you for even agreeing to get this thing passed in the first place.
Right.
And so all of a sudden you have a situation where we don't even know if a permit reform piece of legislation that was promised can even pass. Manchin was quoted recently saying he thinks he may need 20 Republican votes to pass permit reform legislation. To which I say, rot's a ruck.
Yeah.
like Scooby-Doo, right?
Yeah.
Where is he going to get 20 Republican votes? So right now, the thinking is that the prospects of the permit reform are pretty dim.
Okay.
They're not really sure it's going to happen. Well, then if it doesn't happen, what's Manchin going to do? The president already signed the bill. That's part of the law. And their handshake, their backroom handshake between Schumer and Manchin that don't worry, there'll be this separate legislation. What's he going to do now that didn't happen? The last part of your question was, well, how does it relate to what CEQ is doing? We had heard that CEQ is going to act by the end of summer.
Yes.
With phase 2 of the NEPA regulations. Well, looking at my watch, end of summer is what, the 21st, technically? Yeah. So the joke was, of September. So the joke was, well, midnight on the 21st. Maybe you'll see something then. But then the question was, well, why should we go ahead and do that if Congress, through this Manchin compromise bill, was going to legislate more stuff? Like, so why would we write regulations if the legislation potentially could be inconsistent with that, right?
Right.
And so then the thinking was, well, CEQ is going to put off phase 2 to see what, if anything, comes out of the Manchin permit reform. With the prospects of that getting worse and worse, I think CEQ may be now gearing up again to try to get out its proposal because now it has bigger calendar issues. This is going to be a long comment period. There's going to be thousands and thousands of comments on the phase 2 proposal. Then there's going to be a challenge. They really want this done before January 2025.
Of course.
And as hard as it is to think about that, unless they get something out on the table, this year, that gets harder and harder to accomplish. And so originally I thought they were going to wait because the bill was going to come out. But now with the bill seeming less and less likely, and the Democrats really very aggressively in the House, less so in the Senate, but very aggressively in the House saying, forget about it. You're not going to get that support. I think Manchin may have to look elsewhere.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I think you need your own TV show, Fred, because you almost make me want to read the news about this stuff.
Come on.
Almost.
I will probably listen to it from you, but I'm not going to pick up a newspaper and read about it.
So are you like what I used to be when we actually had newspapers, comics first, sports section next, or men maybe?
Crosswords and comics. That's pretty much it.
There we go. Oh my goodness. Oh, hurts my heart.
Do you guys miss like newsprint on your fingers? I do.
Oh yeah. I remember that. I do. And they stopped giving me newspapers, I think, all the way through. I had it through high school and everything. We still got newspapers. So, I'm old enough to know that. I do miss it.
One of the guilty pleasures of law school was, when you'd stop studying and reading your casebook and you'd go over to the portion of the library where they had, those racks with the bamboo things, and they had all the newspapers from around the country. Where I went to, they had, I don't know, they had like 10 or 20, the Globe, the Times, LA, and they got all these newspapers, and they were sitting there on the rack, and it was just such a great feeling to take a break from the cases and pick up the newspapers from around the country and flip through them, and then go wash your hands to go back to your work.
The smell of it, I don't know. Yeah.
No more.
I think I just miss news being like news. Now it's like, it's not news anymore in most places, it's all propaganda and different things. Not that it was always perfect, but it's different. It feels like
it's more entertaining.
And just like real fast. Everything's fast. I don't know. I won't name names, but one of the places I do read news here sometimes, like just the grammar and spelling mistakes and stuff. You're like, man, did anybody even proof this before it went out?
No, I know.
Yeah. And as we discussed, some of the stuff is, so nuanced that, it doesn't lend itself to the lickety split,
Right,
immediate tweet level type analysis that we're seeing. And one of the perspectives I hope I give listeners is the fact that this stuff does develop over time.
Yeah.
It does take time, and it's going to have, ups and downs and peaks and valleys. There can be trends that we see in some of this stuff, but it does take time.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Speaking of things that take time, you mentioned briefly earlier, the SEC has proposed to enhance disclosures on ESG reporting. And no surprise, there's backlash to the proposals in some states. So why is it being proposed? And maybe for obvious, not so obvious reasons, why is there opposition to it?
Yeah, the SEC has been really committed to this rule. Their actions took place in a couple of phases. At first, they went out with a request for information from the financial community, from stakeholders saying, hey, should we do this? It was a loaded question because they were going to do it. But they wanted some more stuff. And they did get hundreds and hundreds of really detailed comments from the community about why this reporting was important and some of the issues with it and so forth. Again, for listeners, SEC disclosure deals not with environmental stuff, it deals with financial stuff, obviously. But the main concept under SEC rules and laws is this concept of materiality. What information is material to a potential investor, to a shareholder about this publicly traded company?
Right.
So, for example, let's say you're a company that owns ski lodges. Well, is it quote unquote material that you used to have a ski season that was 5 months long, and now because of climate, it's 3 months long? Does that affect the bottom line from an investor's perspective, right? And so what the SEC is saying, look, it seems to us that the effects of climate on a whole variety of different industries for a whole variety of different reasons is clearly a quote unquote material thing that you as an investor or as a shareholder would want to know about to see how's the company dealing with this, right? So it's not an environmental law, but it's a financial rule. And so the SEC said, look, I think we need to disclose this information. The question is, what information? How much information? Some of the stuff is pretty straightforward. And what they did is they broke it down into different, they call scopes. Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. That wasn't an SEC term. That is a term in the greenhouse gas reporting world. Scope 1, the stuff that you emit, easy. Greenhouse gases, your factory, poof, you can track that easily, pretty much, because you have to report on it anyhow, probably to environmental agencies, so you do that. Scope 2, the electricity that you use to support your plant or your manufacturing facility or whatnot. Again, not that hard. You get an electric bill at the end of every month. You kind of know that. All the action was on what's so-called Scope 3 emissions. And that's the direct and indirect emissions over the life cycle of your activities. So if you build a widget, what's all the GHG emissions related to the materials that you use to build your widget? The transportation to get your widget out to market, the use of your widget by folks out in the world, and then the disposal of your widget at the end of the life cycle of your widget. Well, this is the area that really got people, kind of up in arms. Some industries, they're doing it already. They're giving it a college try. Other industries are like throwing up their hands and saying, gosh, where do we begin to do this in a way that's valuable? And so that's where I won't say all of the action is. I mean, some folks talked about Scope 1, Scope 2, but that's where a lot of the action is.
Yeah.
And then getting back to our very first question, when you said the state's objections, led by West Virginia as well as some other entities, the concept is, SEC, you're pushing the envelope too far in terms of materiality. We know a lot of things are material, and we know you have the authority to get information into the marketplace. That's your job. But you're pushing it too far here in terms of materiality. And that's going to be the challenge. I mean, there's going to be other aspects of it, but that's going to be the guts of the challenge. The Supreme Court has opined on materiality twice already. This issue has gone up to the Supreme Court twice over the last few decades, and pretty much upholding the authority of the SEC. Oh. So the question is going to be, in this area, can you make SEC the logical argument that Certainly, let's say you're a place that has manufacturing facilities right on the coast, or you're a commercial developer and you build beachside resorts.
Right.
Can you make the nexus between, if the beaches are flooding more, is that going to affect your bottom line? Yes or no? You see? And that's where this is all going to come down. And so the rule itself, very detailed. It gives you instructions on how to file and when to file and stuff like that. But the real heart of the challenge is going to be, can they do this in the first place under the auspices of their existing authority? Remember, we talked about this with EPA. Hey, we regulate hazardous waste all the time. So PFAS, no sweat. SEC is going to say, hey, we regulate materiality all the time. So this is just yet another thing that may be material to the way businesses operate. So no sweat. That's going to be the question. And so I've read the rule. I've read a lot of the comments to the rule. The docket, is very, very long. My sense is that SEC is moving forward with it. They're committed to this rule, and they're going to send out a final rule. The litigation will happen, in a nanosecond, and then the courts will have to, sort it out. But that's what it's all about. And I think it's yet another example of the push me, pull you between the branches of our government. And Congress may say, if you want to do that, we have to tell you. And the agency is going to say, well, you already told us. You already told us. You already said to, govern the marketplace so that it's fair and people have good information. And this is just another way we're doing it. So what's the difference between the materiality related to greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to the materiality of something else that nobody's challenged us that we've been doing for years? That's going to be a very big deal.
If they do decide to move forward with that, how are they going to put into place? How are they going to enforce that?
Well, that's many of the objections that people registered in their comments was asking that question rhetorically. How are you going to enforce this, right? And that's part of the challenge for SEC, which is, when companies report stuff, there's liability attached to it. Because if it's fraudulent or inaccurate, in theory, the SEC could ding a company for doing something like that, right? And a lot of the comments were people saying, well, we're giving it our best shot. We don't know how accurate it really is. So how are you going to enforce this? And the SEC said, hey, don't worry in the rule. There's a phase-in time. We're going to give you some time to get used to it. We really don't intend to do this more, only the most egregious things type of thing. But it's a little bit of a trust me. We're not going to be, crazy in getting this going. And we're going to give you some time to get used to it and whatnot. And that's a real issue, for a court to say, is that good enough? Because the law is the law. You report. It subjects you to liability if your reporting is not correct. And it may not be enough for the agency to say, trust us, we're not going to enforce this so much right away because we understand people are getting used to it. That's going to be part of the challenge. Now, eventually, as reporting gets more routine and some of the standards and some of the information that people need to report GHG emissions gets a little bit more accepted, then it may be fine. And I think a lot of things you're going to see litigated center around, but we're not there yet. So if we're not there yet, how can you make it required and then attach potential liability to it? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think, again, some industries might want to say, we want this because it's not fair. We're doing our level best to try to report and go out into the public. And then Acme Corp comes out and says, oh, we're the greenest thing with no emissions. And they're just fibbing. They're straight out fibbing. Yeah. And that's not fair to me. I don't want to be compared to Acme when they're fibbing. And that's what SEC says, well, that's what we're here for. If somebody's straight out, making it up, we're going to ding them so that the companies that are doing the right thing, get rewarded. I don't know. Not every company is Patagonia, selling itself to the future of the world. I realize that. But, the SEC is trying to more make a level playing field is what they're trying to do. And the question is going to be whether the standards that they laid out in the proposed regulation do that. That's what we're going to find out.
Yeah. No, I love it. It can help consumers make their purchases and also help the businesses say, you know what, maybe we're not doing what we should be doing. But I do also understand the tricky part of trusting the government.
That's right. Yeah. Well, a lot of the comments actually said that, okay, make this reporting voluntary.
Right.
Right.
don't attach the liability to it, and then let the market sort out who's fibbing and who's not.
Yeah.
Because the market tends to do that pretty well. And, I don't know what the SEC will do with that. I think they're pretty committed to try to make it routine across the entire economy. But, a lot of people did say that to the agency. They said, well, if you're so committed to this, given all these uncertainties, great, we'll do it, but make it voluntary. And then the consumer can decide, hey, look at company A, really detailed reporting. I'm really psyched that they're, concentrating on their supply chain and stuff like that. Whereas company B, even I could tell that it looks like these numbers are kind of just, haphazard. And if you want to make an investment decision based on that, you can do it. But it's unclear whether they'll accept that comment to make those scope 3 reporting voluntary or not. But we'll see. I think we'll see something by the end of the year or beginning of next. I truly think that's going to happen.
Yeah, I hope that's the way the world is going.
Yeah.
What? Voluntariness or
doing the right thing because we want, we know I just had a girl in one of my environmental coaching things. She was telling me that they're learning in school that consumers are making the decisions. And, if that's what young people are learning and that's what they're doing, like, I hope a generation from now,
well, and that's the irony in business. And that's the irony of some of these challenges, from, conservative groups. And, again, it's not a political statement, but these are the free market people.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if the market is saying we want electric vehicles, the market is saying we want companies that do this or that in terms of their, operations and sustainability and whatnot. Well, it looks like the market's talked, right? Yeah. The market has spoken. So should we be objecting to that? And then the question is the government overstepping its role to enhance the direction of the marketplace? And I think that's what you're seeing in terms of the challenges. But there's going to be so much activity in the courts. I think the next time we talk, we'll probably have some more discussions about that. And, every day, like I said, something new.
I know. It's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
It really is. Oh.
I have so many questions. Some good, some not good.
Yeah. We got time for like 2 more. One of them has to be about Monza. So
I know we are getting close to, we're already like running out of time. So,
yeah, it's great stuff though. I love it.
Is. And
I was not thinking about any of this when I was at Monza.
Thank you for not.
I was not thinking about any of it. No, I was thinking. But the last time we spoke, I told you about this kind of bucket list kind of trip to see the Italian Grand Prix, accompanying one of my best friends who's a big Formula One fan. And so I went, and it was just spectacular on so many different levels to see the cars and the race and whatnot. But I had one great day that sort of ties together so much of my life and so much of the work that I do. So they took us from the hotel, which was in Como, Italy, up to Monza for the race. And I don't know if you read, but there's over 330,000 people attended the races. So you had to go really, really early to avoid the traffic and just to get into the track. But one day we were really pooped. We didn't want to wake up early to get the bus. And we said, hey, we'll just make our way to the track later on during the day. And so we did some touring around Como, and we're about to leave the hotel. And we asked the nice person at the hotel if he could negotiate a cab ride for us to Monza, because we knew that we could do it very well. And very nicely, he said, cab ride? Why are you going to take a cab ride? No, you take the train. Train goes right to Monza, and there's a shuttle bus to the track. Perfect. And instead of paying, 120 euro, you'll pay 5.
Right.
Well, that sounded pretty good. Give us more for souvenirs at the track.
Right.
And so we felt great. We were like so European. We went from this, small hotel in a village of Como. We walked to the central train station. We even picked out the time of the train. We knew how to say it in Italian. we were ready to go and get to the track. We get to the station, and there's a pretty long line at the ticket booth and at the automated ticket booth right next to it.
Yeah.
And it's not moving very quickly. I wonder what's going on. And then it was like in one of these Hollywood movies where the hero has to get out of town because the bad guys are on his trail. We look up at the screen, and all of a sudden, each of the trains canceled.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
And why is this? A couple of minutes later, somebody comes in, a very nice person, says there's a train strike.
Oh, not a good time for that.
Oh,
well, we're all of a sudden we're saying, we're not going to be able to get to the track. We really want to get to the track today. And what do we do? What do we do? It's, the train's in 10 minutes. And it's like believe it or not, there is the last train on the board is this one train going to Milan with a stop in Monza. But it doesn't look like we're able to get on this train. My friend looks over to the right. Thank goodness, he was very observant. And he sees like a tobacco shop, a convenience store. And he swears that he sees somebody walking out of the convenience store with tickets in their hand. And there's nobody online. So he says, Fred, you go.
Right.
I'll stay here and see if that's a ticket. And now it's like 5 minutes before the train's going to go. Last train to be able to get there. And so I go to the front desk and I said, 2 to Monza. And the guy, very little English, the guy says a tiny, 2, Milan. I said, no, Monza. And he says, no, 2, Milan. I said, no. And I point to my hat. I'm wearing the Ferrari hat. I'm wearing Monza, the race. He says, I know. Monza, Milan. Yelling at me.
Yeah.
And he hands me tickets. And now it's like 2 minutes before the train's going to leave. The last train of the day, because everything else is canceled. I wave to my friend. He runs from the line into the convenience store. And we're going to go through the door to get to the train, which is now at the platform.
Yeah.
And another guy speaking Italian runs up to us, stands in front of the door, and starts yelling, no, with like Italian whatnot. And I'm saying, why no? And I'm waving the ticket in front of him. I said, look, ticket, 1210, train 315, ticket. Again, no, Italian long sentences. And I'm looking at my friend now, it's like 1 minute before the train's going to leave.
Yeah.
Then the guy who sold us the ticket starts yelling in Italian to the guy who's stopping us. And it's apparent what he's saying is just let him go.
Yeah, just let him go.
So the guy opens the door finally, and we're like the last people on the train. And it's packed because it's the last train.
Of course, it's the last train. Yeah.
And for some reason, everyone is standing on this train. Everyone. But there's 2 seats. Like right now.
Wow.
Hey, why aren't people sitting in these seats? So we were all sweaty, we were all nervous. I said, let's just sit down. So we sit down and we're gathering ourselves, and we see kind of people looking at us. They're like staring at us, giving us the evil eye. And I turned to my friend and said, I know we're sweaty a little bit, but is that it? Why are people staring at us? And we're looking around, we're trying to understand what's happening. And finally, after about 10 minutes of the trip, my friend says, look behind you. Look on the seat. And I said, well, what? There's the seat, there's the headrest. He says, well, no, there's a small number 1 stitched into the fabric on the seat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, apparently, nobody's sitting there because it's a first-class seat.
Oh.
and we did not purchase the first class. The guy who was just getting us out, he just gave us a second class seat. So then we're saying, do we get up?
Right.
So we're having this conversation. It was the funniest thing. First of all, the circumstance of getting on the train, sitting in the seat. So finally, the Monza stop is coming up. So we said, okay, we're just going to sit here. We're going to squat in first class for like 12 more minutes. And we finally get up at Monza, and sure enough, when we get up onto the platform, a sea of F1 fans, all wearing Ferrari gear. So we're in the right place. And then eventually we got to the track. But just the act of getting from our hotel to the track that day was almost as much fun as the amazing racing that we saw during the day. But I got to tell you, I'm an environmental lawyer, and traveling for 3.5 days, between Washington and Italy to see a Formula One race is probably the least sustainable thing I've done in my life.
I know.
But one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life. It was amazing. The spirit in the stands, the singing, the support for Ferrari, just the passion that people have for the car race there. And the fact that this was, a historic track. The track in Monza is 100 years old.
Yeah.
It's 100 years old. And they've been running F1 races since 1950. So this is, totally part of the culture in that part of the world. And just a great thing. So happy I did it. And it was a little bit disappointing for the locals because Ferrari couldn't pull it off. But
I know.
When you're up against Max Verstappen and the great car that he has for the Red Bull team, finishing second you got to get used to that.
Yeah, and no mistakes either. My goodness, yeah.
So it was great, and just capped off a wonderful summer.
Gosh, that's so cool. What is this? I love it. The race was fun, but let me tell you the story about the train, and that was awesome.
It was part of the whole experience.
Yeah, of course. That's the joy of
having gelato every night.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Every night.
Yes.
Because you eat really late in Italy. You don't start eating until like 9 p.m.
Yeah.
So I'm having gelato at 10:30, 11 o'clock. And if I'm home, the thought of having ice cream at 11 p.m. every night and go to bed, I never think of it. But I was over there. I said, "Hey, gelato, sure."
Hey, literally, when in Rome, right?
Exactly, or when in Como, So every night there was gelato, and there was like 20 flavors at the shop, and so we were there for 4 nights. So I got through 8 of them. So I told my wife, I said, we have to go back if nothing else because we got 12 more gelato.
Right. Oh, that's great.
That is the joy of travels. Just misadventures in food. I love it. That's great.
I know. It's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I look forward to having you back. We got to go. I know Nick's got proposals to write and stuff. It's that season. Yeah. So thank you, Fred, so much. We look forward to having you back again in a couple months. Glad you made it to the race.
Yeah. And survived.
All right, guys. Thanks as always.
Yeah.
Thanks, Fred.
That's our show. Thanks, Fred, for joining us today. Please be sure to check us out each and every Friday. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. See you, everybody.
Bye.